So welcome everybody to the second lecture of this week. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about something called the demographic transition model. And so this lecture will build a lot from that previous lecture. Mostly we'll be talking about this, but also we'll make some other links to some of the other topics that we've been talking about over the course of the last couple of weeks. So again, hopefully today's lecture will continue to tie a lot of these sorts of concepts that we've been talking about neatly together. Now, before we get into all that, I do want to do a quick recap from yesterday because I feel like we covered a whole lot of ground in yesterday's lecture. So yesterday we talked about the history of infectious disease, how those have been transmitted over time, as well as some ways that we've tried to manage the spread of infectious diseases historically and even today. We talked about how they impact places, particularly in industrialized settings, some changes to, for example, societies and social structures, as well as some ecological changes. And we covered why the burden of infectious disease is particularly high in some industrialized places globally, how it may be impacted by different factors in different places. We also talked about the emergence and reemergence of some infectious diseases over time. And I think it's important to kind of revisit this concept because infectious diseases do obviously continue to be a really, really important source of both mortality and morbidity. And since 1980, the number of infectious disease outbreaks has actually increased over time. However, the per capita outbreak cases have been declining. Does anyone want to help me interpret that? Why would we have that happen? What does that mean? So even though the number of outbreaks is rising, the per capita cases have been declining over time. Why might that be? So why would we see gradually fewer cases? So Reed says better management, more healthcare, lower population density. Anyone else have any ideas? So better management, I'm going to interpret that as better management of the outbreak itself, which, better management of the outbreak itself means that maybe we're following more strict quarantine protocols, for example. So yeah, that could definitely lead to a better containment of an outbreak, which would result in fewer per capita outbreak cases. Nicole had said more healthcare. So more healthcare is tricky because more healthcare would probably impact the level of mortality that we might be seeing from infectious disease outbreaks. So certainly better improved medicine, medical treatments would help that. But in terms of outbreak cases, remember that that is more so referring to the incidence. So what might be influencing new cases of infectious diseases per outbreak. And Lamisa had said lower population density. That's interesting. Yeah, certainly, because we know that less densely populated areas would just have less people coming into contact with one another. And so that could certainly lower the number of cases in a given outbreak setting. So certainly maybe in some growing suburban settings that might be happening, whereas in urban settings, we would probably actually see the opposite because urban populations are overall expanding, they're growing. And we also talked about some of these outbreaks having these zoonotic sources. And so I'm going to talk about why. Remember that we've been talking a lot about these human environment interactions. and how human population dynamics have played a big role. So when we're talking about the diversity and density of populations, but also the level of development in a population, we also touched on that, I think it was a couple of weeks ago. And then these changes to ecosystems that we've really been discussing in a lot of detail over the last couple of weeks. So these have all had really, really important ways of shaping modern day infectious disease transmission, especially from zoonotic sources, because we have had a lot of contact with a lot of these wildlife or animal species. So we talked about some examples previously in the, I believe it was last week, so things like agriculture, as well as spillover events. So anytime you have these environments where a potential pathogen might jump species because those species are all kind of intermingling in one setting. And of course, just more interaction with wildlife can certainly impact that. Now, something that we haven't really spent a lot of time talking about is how all these things might potentially impact chronic diseases. We've spent the bulk of time talking about infectious diseases. So today we're actually going to talk a little bit more about chronic diseases, which is a really, really important piece of the puzzle as well. So the sort of question that we'll be exploring is, how have the strides made in controlling infectious diseases impacted chronic disease? Is there any sort of relationship there between the two? So as a refresher, what do we mean when we're talking about chronic diseases? Well, they are essentially any sort of non-contagious condition that lasts a year or more, and they generally require some sort of ongoing medical attention, some kind of maintenance, potentially prescription medication over time. Now, chronic diseases are also sometimes called non-communicable because they are not infectious, they're not contagious between individuals, you can't catch it from someone else. And they're also referred to as diseases of affluence. And this is perhaps a bit of a misnomer because although chronic diseases are more prevalent in countries like Canada and countries like the States, where the level of economic development tends to be higher, so that's why they're called affluence. But as I think we'll see over the course of today's lecture, chronic diseases do impact a pretty wide swath of the population, and certainly their prevalence globally is increasing over time. And so we'll get to that. Now, the risk factors associated with many chronic diseases, I think many of them that many of us are familiar with, so things that we call lifestyle factors, things like tobacco use, secondhand smoke exposure, alcohol consumption, poor nutrition, lack of physical activity, but also environmental and occupational exposures, which I think we've talked a little bit here and there about, things like air pollution, of course, water pollution, things like that. Also genetic factors, as well as potential government policies could really impact the way that many of these risk factors interact with one another and may produce certain chronic diseases to be more prevalent in some societies. So I do want to highlight just the importance of chronic diseases, particularly in a place like Ontario. So here we've got a figure which shows us that about 3/4 of all causes of death are due to chronic diseases. So that's a pretty huge chunk in Ontario. And of that, most of them are cancer diagnoses, cancer deaths, followed by cardiovascular disease, as well as some other chronic diseases. So they do really, really play an important role in health and medicine, particularly in the Canadian context, as well as overall in many industrialized nations around the world. Now, this brings us to the demographic transition model. So if you thought that you didn't have to think about this model again for some time, you are mistaken. But to sort of refresh our memory here, the demographic transition model showed us how outbreaks of disease, not how outbreaks of disease, but rather how populations have gone through different transitions over time. And so this is partially influenced by things like outbreaks of diseases. So we talked about, especially in this early stage of the demographic transition, that things like epidemics or outbreaks of diseases tended to keep populations in check, but also how other factors could really influence the population transition that nations go through, particularly things like economic development And so this is something that we touched on a couple weeks back. And before we get into how the demographic transition model relates to the epidemiologic transition model, I figured we should actually define what is it that we mean by outbreaks of infectious disease. We've been talking about a lot of these words throughout the course of the last couple of weeks, but it's probably a good time to actually define them going forward and to make sure that we're all using consistent definitions. So the outbreak of infectious disease, remember, we often talk about in the context of serving as population checks, particularly in the demographic transition model. In those early stages of the model, they really serve to sort of limit population growth to becoming exponentially higher. Now, an outbreak can be classified in 3 different ways. So one way would be an epidemic. So this is usually defined as some increase, often a sudden increase in the number of cases of a disease above what's normally expected in a population in a particular area. So this was something like the Ebola epidemic, which was really concentrated primarily in Western and Central Africa. Also things like SARS, which were concentrated primarily in Asia as well as Canada. And unlike an epidemic, a pandemic is kind of a more extreme epidemic. So it's an epidemic that has spread over several countries or continents, and it usually affects a much larger proportion of the population, much larger burden of disease. So there haven't been as many pandemics as you can imagine. One was the Spanish flu back in 1918, and then COVID-19, unfortunately, has become a pandemic for history to look back on. Now, there isn't any sort of strict measure to dictate when an epidemic suddenly becomes a pandemic. It's not like this happens overnight. Usually it's key stakeholders with the World Health Organization that get together to really look at the evidence, to take a look at how much the disease has spread, as well as the potential for the disease to continue spreading. And so they'll make a kind of collective decision about whether or not a given epidemic might meet the criteria for a pandemic. Now, another way to characterize these outbreaks, and I think we've used this word a couple of times, so I hope I haven't confused anyone when we've been using it, but we call something endemic when a disease is usually present, has an almost constant presence in a given population or geographic area. And so we say that it's endemic when, a visitor or any population is likely to encounter it in that particular setting. So usually when we talk about diseases that are endemic, they might be related to particular pathogens that are really prevalent in that given area because of the niches that we talked about. So because their geographic scope, their niche perfectly lines up with a particular region, then you would expect to find that species of pathogen there. So an example of that is soil transmitted helminths, which is in this map here. So you can see that soil transmitted helminths, which are a type of parasite, are endemic to many regions of the world, displayed here with the reds and the sort of orange colors on the map. So now that we've got an understanding of how to characterize those outbreaks, let's talk about this epidemiologic transition model. So if the demographic transition model primarily showed population change, the epidemiologic transition model really shows a change in disease patterns over time. So not as focused on population, but more so how diseases have shifted over time. And generally, we talk about this transition in terms of infectious to more chronic. So it shows how the shift of the disease burden has changed over time, what the causes of mortality are primarily at different stages of this transition model. So there are 4 stages, like the demographic transition model, and they roughly line up together. And so generally, a lot of the population trends that we talked about in the context of the demographic transition model are factors that actually would influence the different stages of the epidemiologic transition model. So in stage 1, which we call pestilence and famine, Remember that this stage from the demographic transition model was characterized by high birth rates, high death rates, and we talked about this in the context of epidemics and famines. So this is why we call it the stage of pestilence and famine, because this period of the epidemiologic transition model is really characterized by contact with pathogens, famines, wars, conflicts, things that keep the population in check. And infectious diseases are really the high disease burden, the type of disease that is predominant during this stage of the model. Now, stage 2, what we call receding pandemics. Remember that the demographic transition model characterized this stage as one with high birth rates, declining death rates, and this was primarily because of changes in nutrition, changes in the standards of living. And so we saw that although high birth rates were still kind of ongoing, that mortality started to decline because of these changes. So in the context of the epidemiologic transition model, this is because pandemics and infectious disease threats start to decline. They're not playing as big of a role in terms of causes of death as they were in the previous stage. And again, this is because of those changes to kind of human interactions, their better standards of living, and improvements to nutrition. Another thing worth noting for this particular stage is that the reduction of child and maternal infections, so particularly from that subset of the population, that is what's really driving the declining death rates, because usually in this stage, you start to see a decline in those types of infections among children and among pregnant women or women who have just given birth. Now, the third stage, this is what we call the degenerative and man-made diseases stage. So remember from the demographic transition model that this is a stage where both birth rates and mortality rates continue to decline. So it's no longer just mortality, but also the birth rates. And this is primarily dictated by more economic factors. So changes to lifestyles, improvements to medicine, but also more women entering the workforce, so they're not having as many children. And so this brings about another sort of change in the epidemiologic transition model, where a lot of these changes to lifestyles have actually brought about an increased prevalence of chronic diseases. And again, you're seeing infectious diseases play a much smaller role. This is also potentially due to some changes to behaviors like more sedentary behaviors as people kind of transition to different work. Thanks, Regina. Have a good day.
Bye. Have a good lecture, everyone.
Thanks. And so many of the changes happening in the economic and social structures are also ones that are impacting the epidemiologic transition in this stage. So again, we're seeing that transition to more chronic disease burden compared to infectious. Now, in the fourth stage, so this one is called delayed degenerative diseases and emerging infections. So in this particular stage, remember that the demographic transition model told us that there would be low birth rates, and because of the decline in mortality, you actually start to see much longer life expectancies compared to the other stage. And so this is also important to note because the epidemiologic transition model of this stage tells us that because of a lot of improved treatments, in preventative medicine as well, so public health programs and things like that, you actually start to see people living longer, but they're not necessarily living healthier lives. So you start to see people with more comorbidities. So they might have different chronic diseases ongoing at the same time. And as you can imagine, that might also impact people's susceptibility to infectious diseases. And so you start to see in this stage of the epidemiologic transition model that emerging infections do start to kind of make a small comeback in portions of the population. So you don't necessarily see those large-scale epidemics that you see in the very first stage, although I guess some would argue that we're finding ourselves in a situation like that right now. But generally, you would characterize the stage with some infectious disease burden, but still mostly talking about chronic diseases being much more prevalent in this stage. So how do we connect a lot of these different things together? Why do we talk about both demography and epidemiology at the same time? Why do we have these two models together? Well, we talked about how human population characteristics do impact disease transmission. So we talked about that previously in the way that age structures are impacted differently. So child versus maternal health versus older age individuals, but also characteristics of the population when we talk about things like density, diversity of different traits in a population, as well as human migration. So we talked about that quite a bit. But also we've talked about how disease transmission impacts population characteristics, right? So diseases quite obviously have an impact on things like mortality as well as birth rates, because we know that people tend to have more children, they tend to have more births if they know that the likelihood of surviving, of having their child survive, is quite low due to things like pathogens. But also it can impact life expectancy. And we've also discussed how it can impact selective pressures. So human genetics and the genome can actually be impacted by a particular way that a pathogen might spread in a population or in a given geographic context. So hopefully after comparing both the demographic transition model as well as the epidemiologic transition model, it's clear just how much the study of demography, so populations, as well as epidemiology, so study of disease, how much these two things are really interconnected and how they really play an important influence on one another. So it's almost impossible to talk about them separately. In fact, it is much more useful to really think about them in the same kind of context, and always keep in the back of your mind whenever you're talking about a transition of diseases that you're also talking about some transition of population characteristics at the same time. So hopefully that's pretty clear. Now, as you can imagine, the transition between these epidemiologic stages doesn't happen overnight. So it takes time for many places to shift from some of those early stages of the transition model where infectious diseases are predominant to later stages of the model where really chronic diseases become much more prevalent. So what happens? Well, many places in the world face what we call this double burden of disease, where infectious diseases are still ongoing, they're still present, but the prevalence of chronic diseases is also rising due to shifts in lifestyle factors, as well as longer life expectancy due to medical advancements and things like that. Now, the double burden of disease disproportionately impacts low and middle income countries. Again, for obvious reasons, because in many ways their own demographic transition model is shifting, right? So they're shifting from sort of a lower industrialized economic state to a more higher level of economic development. Now, why is that a problem? Why is this double burden of disease such a tricky thing that public health experts want to try to tackle? Well, again, the treatment of infectious diseases and chronic diseases are very different. So they require a different level of expertise. They require different medical practitioners and different levels of awareness from doctors, because they might not be looking for the same type of symptoms in order to treat infectious and chronic diseases. But also the threat of infectious diseases and chronic diseases, pose very, very different risks to populations. So usually infectious diseases pose this sort of acute threat, right? Usually you develop symptoms and those symptoms develop really quickly with an infectious disease, and you have to seek treatment on a much faster scale. Whereas something like a chronic disease might develop over a significant period of time, and it just requires a much different way of sort of approaching the problem from that perspective. Now, it's important to note that the double burden of disease also doesn't impact all segments of the population the same way. So remember how we talked about children and mothers being particularly susceptible to those changes in the epidemiologic transition model. And I think this figure kind of shows one aspect of that. So this is a figure of the mortality in India in the sort of early 1990s. Now, keep in mind that India was a very different place back then. So in the early 1990s, it was still very much an expanding economy. It was sort of characterized in one of those more middle stages. And so what did you see? Well, there was this problem of the double burden of disease, right? So the light sort of bluish green here is showing us the mortality rates from diarrheal diseases. And as you can see, it's significantly higher among the younger age population. This is kind of the opposite trend that you see with the rates of mortality from emphysema. And so emphysema was mostly caused by an increase in air pollution levels, as well as rising cases of smoking. And so you really had to tackle these problems very differently because, as we know, diarrheal disease is mostly caused by pathogen spread through contaminated water, contaminated food. And so you're talking about solving that problem with perhaps infrastructural changes and things like that, whereas something like emphysema would require a totally different way of approaching the problem. You would want to treat the symptoms very differently, and you would want to talk about a completely different set of policies to try to address that particular health problem. Now, another place in the world that was facing this double burden of disease is Zimbabwe. And this is not uncommon, unfortunately, for many places in Africa. But Zimbabwe was particularly hard hit with the HIV epidemic in the 1990s. But luckily over time, they did develop some better survivorship, mostly due to changes in the way that we were treating individuals with HIV. And so many of them were living longer before they progressed to the AIDS stage that is associated with high death. As you can imagine, the medical treatments really, really helped to improve this life expectancy and to improve the burden of that particular disease. Now, at the same time, levels of chronic diseases have been rising in more recent years. So let's take a look at that. So in the 1990s, again, we saw mostly deaths from tuberculosis and HIV/AIDS. And although those are still in the top spot, we're also seeing the increased rank of some of these more chronic diseases. So things like cancer have risen up, diabetes rates have risen up quite substantially, as well as other more chronic issues such as chronic respiratory. So this tells us that over time, many places like Zimbabwe will start to see fewer deaths associated with those infectious diseases as they start to transition through this epidemiologic transition through to developing more prevalent cases of chronic diseases compared to infectious diseases. So this kind of raises the question of, can we spare other nations the same fate? Or is every, slowly industrializing nation kind of bound to deal with this double burden of disease? Well, picking up with some of the things that we were talking about towards the very end of yesterday's class, there are ways to actually manage both infectious and chronic diseases, but you do need very strong public health systems as well as medical health systems. So when we're talking about infectious diseases, you do really need investments in public health systems for things like surveillance. And surveillance is just kind of a systematic way of tracking many of these infections, because if you don't know how many people are actually getting something like tuberculosis, there's really not a good way to address the problem in terms of knowing how many antibiotics you need to order for a given population, or how to go about doing any public health programs to help people increase their awareness about a particular disease. And so you really do need a lot of that public health system in place. Other things that you would need are things like infection control programs. So things as simple as anti-mosquito nets for malaria, but also mass vaccination campaigns that occur usually in countries that have A, enough money to do that, but B, also a really strong public health infrastructure that would allow the dissemination of vaccines across different clinics, across different places. So you really need a certain sort of toolbox to address many of these infectious diseases. On the other hand, the management of chronic diseases does require some very different things. So you would need a public health system that manages the risk factors. So remember that we talked about some of those lifestyle factors that do increase your risk of many chronic diseases. So things like smoking and alcohol. Well, you do need policies in place that usually try to dissuade people from a lot of those type of risky behaviors that are associated with many chronic diseases. And you also need some interventions that would shift diets and physical activity levels away from the sort of Western industrialized model to a more healthy level that hopefully would allow many of these types of nations to avoid this double burden of disease that others are experiencing. So it can be done, but it does take a certain level of advancement in the public health system as well as medical system. Now, linking back to last week, how have changes to ecosystems and land use influenced the epidemiologic transition? Well, remember that we talked a lot about those pathogen dynamics in the context of disease ecology, as well as the interactions between different species, so hosts, pathogens, as well as vectors. And as humans kind of set on this course of development, they've also changed ecosystems in ways that not only impact infectious diseases, but also impact chronic diseases. So we'll take a look at some of those. I think one of the first important ways is through changes of agriculture and farming. So on the one hand, we have been able to produce more food, which has resulted in better nutrition overall. We've also been able to control things like irrigation systems used for agricultural practices. So generally that has had positive impacts and the result of fewer pathogens. We've also used some antibiotics to control pathogens in livestock, which again, on the one hand, has reduced a lot of the spread of these types of pathogens in wildlife settings as well as livestock. So, you know, on the one hand, generally, we would say that a lot of those changes to farming practices and agriculture have overall resulted in less infectious disease. But there are some ways that they've perhaps resulted in more chronic disease. So because we've been able to grow significantly more food, there has been this surplus of cheap processed foods, particularly from crops like wheat and soybean, which are a little bit cheaper to grow on a wide scale. And so some studies have linked some of these changes to the diversity and the quantity of different crops to more obesogenic types of foods and the production of those types of foods. Now, another interesting way that it has perhaps affected chronic disease is through the use of pesticides. Now, I put a little asterisk here on this slide because it's currently still up for debate in terms of what chronic disease impacts might be associated with pesticide exposure. Again, we generally have a sense that it likely increases your risk if you are exposed to pesticides, mostly occupationally, not so much if you are eating foods that have used pesticides, because generally the levels there are considered quite low. But if as a farmer, let's say you're exposed to these pesticides, then we know that sometimes there have been increased risks of things like cancers, neurological issues, as well as respiratory impacts, so things like asthma. Now, another sort of change to farming practices has been the automation of farms, which generally we would all agree has led to less physical activity, right? So farmers don't have to actually go to tend their crops, which may or may not result in less physical activity and higher rates of obesity. What about changes to urbanization? So again, I think we touched on this a little bit last week, where overall, we would say that urbanization has led to less infectious disease outbreaks. And generally, this is because of better sanitation infrastructure, fewer disease vectors. So, in an urban setting, you're generally maintaining the environment such that you wouldn't necessarily see pools of stagnant water that would provide a breeding ground for things like mosquitoes, but also just having more access to public health services through better access to things like clinics and hospitals, medical treatment. On the other hand, there are some ways that urbanization could be leading to more chronic diseases. So one way that is increasingly being explored by researchers is how the gut microbiome, so the levels of microbes and microorganisms in your digestive tract, how those have changed between urban versus rural communities, and how that might impact gastrointestinal disorders and issues. There's also quite obviously more pollutants in urban settings due to things like industries, factories, as well as more cars in a given geographic setting. So that has some pretty obvious issues on respiratory chronic disease. Then there's this problem of access to fast food, which some may or may not argue is more of a problem in urban settings, which can lead to obesity, particularly in some very low income neighborhoods of urban environments. And climate change is another important change which humans have caused to kind of have impacts on the spread of infectious as well as chronic diseases. And so last week we talked about this primarily through the lens of things like increased fungal infections. So that was one of the case studies we looked at, as well as increasing spread of many vectors due to climate change. So when we talked about things like ticks and vectors like mosquitoes, but there are also some pretty significant impacts from climate change on chronic diseases as well. So one of them would be, as we expect more wildfires, we do expect the smoke from many of these fires to actually trigger significantly larger burdens of respiratory chronic diseases like asthma. There's also the matter of more heat, so more heat-related events like heat strokes. Scientists are also really interested in how warming temperatures might overall impact the levels of pollen from plants and vegetation, and how that might trigger more allergic responses in populations. So there's many, many ways that climate change as well can impact chronic disease prevalence, not just transmission of infectious pathogens. So if the threat of pathogens has changed over time, how have our immune systems responded to the epidemiologic transition? Right, we've had significant efforts in trying to control and manage infectious diseases, perhaps somewhat unsuccessfully given today's context of COVID. But I think it's important to remember that our immune system might also potentially be impacted. So for a quick sort of TLDR in terms of how the immune system works, antigens are these bacteria, fungus, some kind of foreign invader that would enter the body. And the presence of these antigens in the body generally triggers some immune response in a human body. Now, the more that we are exposed to those antigens, so to those foreign kind of invaders, the more that we develop immunity via antibodies that our body produces. So anytime those antigens re-enter our body at a later date, our body has those antibodies that can then be launched because they remember how to attack that particular antigen. So this is why the immune system is really, really important in terms of building up immune tolerance to pathogens. And generally, the more that you are exposed to those pathogens, the more that you would have an immune system that's adapted to be able to effectively fight those infections. So this brings us to this interesting theory, the Hygiene Hypothesis, which was really advocated for, I think, back in the 1990s. It was first proposed in 1989, and it was used to try to explain the rise in many of the autoimmune as well as allergic diseases and disorders that were coming up around then. So early proponents of this hypothesis thought that it was due to a lack of pathogen exposure. So because we weren't exposed to a lot of those, let's say, vaccine preventable diseases, that was to blame for the rise in allergies and autoimmune disorders. But nowadays, immunology researchers are trying to think of this in another way, because obviously the more that you're impacted to, or the more that you're exposed to deadly pathogens, the more likely you are to die from exposure to those pathogens. And so they think it's actually the lack of exposure to harmless, non-pathogenic microorganisms that is playing the bigger role here. So instead of the hygiene hypothesis, many researchers are trying to rename it into a microbial diversity hypothesis or a microbiome hypothesis, although none of those really have the same ring to it. But really, it's to highlight that it's not so much that we're not exposed to pathogens, but that we're perhaps not exposed to as many harmless microorganisms, things like bacteria, fungi that naturally exist in the environment, but because of the changes to the way that we live, we're no longer as exposed to many of those microorganisms. So this is an interesting study that was done 10 years ago now. And this was looking at the rates of childhood asthma in children who lived on farms compared to those who didn't live on farms. And they also took a look at how these different children, the ones that lived on farms and the ones that didn't, how they were exposed to bacteria or fungi differently. And they were interested because studies by this point had already started to look into many immune-related disorders that had been linked to differences in exposure to microbial diversity. So remember, going back to that so-called hypothesis theory. And so this study, and many others as well that followed the study, were able to actually link that children who lived on farms were exposed to a wider range, a larger diversity of different bacteria and fungi. So that's what you see here in the blue. And so the children that lived on farms had more exposure to these microbiomes, and they also had lower rates of asthma. So that was interesting. This is sort of where the hypothesis around microbial diversity really started to take off. This naturally leads us to the question of allergies and what may or may not play a role in how allergies come to be. Full disclosure, I'm someone with allergies. I'm allergic to all nuts. And so I was particularly fascinated when I was doing research for this slide, because I think this is really, really an interesting area of research that will continue to expand in the coming years, given the prevalence of allergies in many industrialized societies specifically. So researchers do think that the gut microbiome, so again, the diversity of different microbes in the digestive tract, that has a link to actually preventing food allergies in individuals. And so what they think is that when you look at the microbiome from individuals with allergies, they tend to have less diverse bacteria when you compare that to the gut microbiome of those who don't have allergies. And so you can see that in this particular study here, where they're looking at the abundance of this particular bacteria, which they think is one of the ones that are really important in terms of its potential link to allergies. And so they saw that there was much more of this particular bacteria in the gut of people who didn't have allergies in their case control study. So pharmaceutical companies, always wanting to be the first to discover things and the first to make money off things, are actually looking at ways to develop these potential microbial capsules. So something similar to probiotics, which already exist, but specifically for adults with things like peanut allergies or other allergies. But although this is perhaps really promising, in a lot of the early clinical trials where they've been testing out these potential microbial capsules, they've realized that the risk is pretty significant anytime you're introducing microbes from a healthy, non-allergenic person to a healthy or to a person with allergies. This is because they're usually taking these from stool samples. And so there is a pretty obvious risk of transmission anytime you are introducing pathogenic bacteria into a new person from someone who maybe has developed some immune tolerance. Lamisa says, what about allergies to certain medication? Is that also linked to gut microbiomes? That's a good question. I'm actually not sure. This is such a new area of research that I'm not 100% sure that people would really know the answer to that just yet. I think so far they've focused on allergies that are really, really common because there's just so many more people that they can test in clinical trials if they stick to allergies that are really, really common. But yeah, I expect that as time goes on, they'll be able to figure out whether these potential gut changes, the changes to the diversity of bacteria in people's guts, whether that might also have a link to medication and allergies to medication. So things like penicillin are also pretty commonly allergic to, as well as some other antibiotics. So I think time will tell. I'm not 100% sure whether we know that just yet. So in any case, the microbiota is the one piece of the puzzle in terms of allergies. Of course, we do think it's a lot more complicated than that. It's likely also, factors having to do with genetics, factors having to do with other environmental exposures. So I'm sure that we'll find out as time goes on that a lot of these different risk factors are all kind of linked together, and it's unlikely that the gut microbiome is kind of the only thing that is different between those who develop allergies and those who don't have allergies. But yeah, stay tuned to see how this research might go on in the coming years. That's all I have for today. So I did finish a few minutes early. If anybody still has any questions about the assignment that's due later today, do let me know. I can stick around for a few minutes.